My name is Ricardo Mendoza, and I'm writing this from my truck during my lunch break at a construction site in Houston, where I'm working my second job of the day after starting at 5 a.m. at another site. Try to earn enough money to support my wife Elena and our 2 children here in Texas, while also sending $1,200 every month to Mexico to support my parents, my younger sister with disabilities, and my brother's family who lost their home in the pandemic, stretching my $45,000 annual construction worker salary across 8 people in 2 countries, 2 sets of bills, 2 healthcare systems, 2 educational systems, and 2 families who both depend on me as their primary financial support while I'm drowning in debt, working 70-hour weeks that are destroying my health, carrying crushing guilt about never sending enough money to either family, and feeling trapped between 2 countries that both judge me for not doing enough while I'm literally killing myself trying to keep everyone afloat. At 34, my body feels 60 from the physical labor and stress. I had a day off in 8 months. My marriage is strained by financial pressure. My children barely see me because I'm always working. And I'm one emergency away from complete financial collapse that would devastate families in both countries who have no backup plan if I fail. The transnational financial obligation began when I immigrated to the United States at age 22 as an undocumented worker, crossing the border to escape poverty in my rural Mexican hometown, where there were no job opportunities, and my family was barely surviving on my father's sporadic agricultural work. The plan was always that I would work in America and send money home to support my family. That was the entire purpose of my migration. The reason my parents supported my dangerous border crossing despite their fears, and the expectation that has governed every financial decision I've made for the past 12 years. The remittance pressure started immediately upon finding my first construction job in Houston, earning $300 per week under the table as an undocumented laborer with no workplace protections, no benefits, and constant vulnerability to wage theft and exploitation. Despite earning barely enough to cover my own rent in a shared apartment with 5 other Mexican workers, I began sending $400 monthly to my parents because that money meant the difference between my family eating adequately or going hungry, between my siblings attending school or dropping out to work, and between my mother getting medical care for her diabetes or suffering without treatment. The family multiplication happened when I married Elena, also a Mexican immigrant, and we started our own family with the birth of our daughter Sophia, and then our son Miguel. Suddenly I had a wife and children in Houston whose needs were immediate and daily: rent, food, utilities, diapers, childcare while Elena worked her cleaning job, medical care when they got sick, while also maintaining my financial obligations to my parents and siblings in Mexico, whose survival still depended on the remittances I had been sending for years and couldn't suddenly stop without devastating consequences. The impossible math became my daily nightmare as I tried to allocate my limited income across 2 families in 2 countries with completely different cost structures. In Houston, our family of 4 needed at least $2,500 monthly for basic survival, $1,100 rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in a low-income neighborhood, $600 for food, $200 for utilities, $150 for Elena's bus pass to work, $200 for our children's needs, and $250 for other basic expenses. In Mexico, my family of 5 needed at least $1,200 monthly, my parents' rent, food for the household, my mother's diabetes medications, my sister's disability-related expenses, and support for my brother's family who had moved in with my parents after losing their income. The chronic shortfall meant that my $3,750 monthly take-home pay after taxes had to cover $3,700 in basic survival, expenses across 2 countries, before accounting for any unexpected costs, medical emergencies, car repairs, children's school needs, or the many other expenses that constantly arose. There was no money for savings, no emergency fund, no room for error, and constant juggling of which bills to pay and which to delay, which families need to prioritize, and which necessities to sacrifice. The second job became mandatory as I realized one construction job wasn't sufficient for supporting 2 families. So I began working second shifts, weekends, and any available overtime to increase my income. I would start at 5 a.m. at one construction site, work until 2 p.m., drive across Houston to another site, and work from 3 p.m. until 8 or 9 p.m. Then drive home exhausted to eat dinner and collapse into bed before repeating the cycle. The 70-hour work weeks generated approximately $4,500 monthly, but left me no time with my children, no energy for my marriage, and no life beyond work and sleep. The health deterioration began within 2 years of the schedule, as my body started breaking down from the physical demands of construction, labor combined with chronic sleep deprivation, poor diet from eating fast food between jobs, and stress from constant financial pressure. I developed back pain that made every movement agony, but I couldn't stop working because both families depended on my income, and there was no safety net, no sick leave, no disability insurance, and no one else to support 8 people if I couldn't work. The medical care avoidance became necessary despite my health problems, because seeking medical treatment cost money I didn't have and time I couldn't afford to take off work. I worked through injuries, ignored symptoms, and self-medicated with over-the-counter pain relievers rather than seeing doctors who would charge hundreds of dollars for visits and prescriptions. The short-term savings of avoiding medical care created long-term health consequences that I tried not to think about while focusing on immediate survival. The impossible choices happened daily as I decided whether to send extra money for my mother's insulin or pay for my daughter's school supplies, whether to fix our unreliable car or send money for my brother's children's food, whether to buy groceries for Houston or send emergency funds for Mexico's unexpected crisis. Every financial decision meant choosing one family's needs over another's, and the guilt was crushing regardless of which choice I made, because someone always suffered from my insufficient resources. The remittance guilt was constant from my family in Mexico, who didn't understand why I couldn't send more money when I was working in America, where everyone assumed people earned vast fortunes. They didn't comprehend that Houston's cost of living consumed most of my income, that supporting my American family took significant resources, or that construction workers in Texas didn't earn the mythical American salaries that Mexican popular culture portrayed. Their requests for additional money, for medical emergencies, for home repairs, for children's education expenses, came with expectations that I had unlimited American wealth, rather than understanding I was struggling to survive on working-class wages that barely covered basic needs. The American family resentment emerged as Elena became increasingly frustrated about our constant financial stress, our inability to save money, the children's needs going unmet, and my working schedule that left her essentially a single parent while I was physically present but completely exhausted. She understood intellectually that I had obligations to my family in Mexico, but emotionally she resented that her children's needs were competing with my parents' needs and that we couldn't achieve basic middle-class stability because I was supporting 2 households on one working-class salary. The marriage strain intensified during financial emergencies when we had no savings to handle unexpected expenses and had to choose between our own crisis and my family's crisis in Mexico. When Sophia needed dental work costing $800, Elena was furious that I was considering not sending remittances that month to cover the dental expenses, arguing that our daughter's health should take priority over my parents' bills. When my mother needed emergency surgery costing $1,500, Elena was devastated that I was taking money from our rent savings to send to Mexico, creating risk of eviction for our Houston family. The children's sacrifices included living in a cramped apartment in a high-crime neighborhood because it was all we could afford, attending underfunded public schools without resources for extracurricular activities or enrichment programs, wearing second-hand clothes and using hand-me-down toys because new items were unaffordable luxuries, and growing up knowing that their father worked constantly but they remained poor while their classmates had things they couldn't have. The cultural expectations from both sides created impossible pressures, as Mexican family members expected that as the family member who had successfully migrated to America, I would be the primary financial support for extended family, while American society expected that as a father, I would prioritize my children's needs and opportunities over supporting adult relatives who should be self-sufficient. Neither cultural framework acknowledged the reality of being working class in America with transnational family obligations. The remittance system exploitation added another layer of financial burden as money transfer services charge 5 to 7% fees for sending funds to Mexico, meaning that $1,200 sent monthly actually cost me $1,270 to $1,284 after transfer fees. The exploitation was blatant. Companies profiting from immigrant obligations to support families across borders, extracting hundreds of dollars annually in fees from people who could least afford the additional costs. Alternative methods like informal courier services carried risks of theft or loss, creating impossible choices between expensive formal services or risky informal transfers. The currency fluctuation vulnerability meant that when the peso weakened against the dollar, my family in Mexico had more purchasing power for my remittances. But when the peso strengthened, my fixed dollar remittances bought less, creating pressure to send more money to maintain their standard of living despite my own family's constant needs. I had no control over exchange rates, but bore all consequences of currency fluctuations that affected my family's survival in Mexico. The emergency absence of planning became devastating when unexpected expenses arose simultaneously in both countries. Sophia's dental emergency while my father needed surgery, our car breaking down while my sister needed emergency medical care, our rent increasing while my brother's family needed housing support. With no savings and no credit access as a working-class immigrant with limited credit history, every emergency created cascading crises that I had no resources to handle beyond working more hours that didn't exist and making impossible choices about whose emergency took priority. The legal status complications meant that as an undocumented immigrant for most of my years in America, I had no access to social services that might have eased financial pressure. No food stamps, no housing assistance, no Medicaid for my family, no unemployment insurance, no workers' compensation when injured, and no legal recourse when employers cheated me on wages or refused overtime pay I had earned. The undocumented status maximized my economic exploitation while providing no safety net for the transnational financial obligations I carried. The legalization relief came when I finally received a green card through DACA and later marriage-based permanent residency, providing legal work authorization that allowed me to access better-paying construction jobs with benefits and more stable employment. My income increased to $45,000 annually, but the financial relief was marginal because my legal status meant I was now paying taxes, reducing take-home pay, while my family obligations had only increased as my parents aged and my siblings faced new crises requiring support. The breaking point came when I collapsed at a construction site from exhaustion and stress, hitting my head on concrete and being hospitalized with concussion that prevented me from working for 3 weeks. The medical bills from the emergency room visit and hospital stay totaled $8,000, even with the minimal insurance my employer provided, while the lost wages from missed work meant I couldn't send full remittances to Mexico or cover full expenses in Houston, creating simultaneous financial crises in both countries that my family blamed me for despite the crisis being caused by the unsustainable pace I had been maintaining for their benefit. The hospital social worker who noticed my extreme stress asked about what was causing my health crisis, and I broke down explaining the impossible financial situation of supporting 2 families in 2 countries on one working-class salary. She referred me to a community health center where I could access counseling with therapists who worked with immigrant families dealing with transnational financial stress and chronic guilt about never doing enough for either family. The therapy that helped me process the accumulated stress was with Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a Mexican-American psychologist who specialized in working with immigrants carrying transnational family obligations and understood that my situation was an individual failure, but reflected systematic problems with working-class immigrant economics and impossible expectations placed on immigrants to single-handedly support extended families across borders on wages that barely sustain one household. The expectation that individual immigrants will serve as economic lifelines for entire extended families across borders is a form of structural exploitation that places impossible burdens on working-class immigrants, Dr. Gonzalez explained during one of our sessions. Your $45,000 annual salary is working-class income in Houston that's barely sufficient for a family of 4. Yet you're trying to stretch it to support 8 people across 2 countries with completely different economic realities. The guilt you feel about not doing enough ignores the fundamental reality that you're already doing more than should be expected of any individual, and that the real problem is a lack of economic opportunity in Mexico that creates dependency on remittances and the lack of living wages in America that make it impossible for working-class immigrants to achieve financial stability. She helped me understand that my health collapse was my body's rebellion against unsustainable demands, that I was experiencing caregiver burnout despite being separated by borders from one of the families I was caring for, and that setting boundaries about what I could realistically provide financially was necessary for survival, even though it would create guilt and disappoint family members who had come to depend on my remittances. The boundary-setting work involved the excruciating process of reducing my monthly remittances to Mexico from $1,200 to $800, acknowledging that I could not continue sacrificing my health, my marriage, and my children's well-being to maintain the previous level of support. The conversation with my parents about the reduction was one of the hardest discussions I've ever had, explaining that I was literally killing myself to support them and that I needed to prioritize my own family survival and my health to continue providing any support at all. The family reaction in Mexico ranged from understanding to resentment as my parents accepted the reduction, but my siblings were angry about decreased support. Some accusing me of abandoning the family now that I had legal status and better employment, not understanding that legal status came with increased expenses, taxes, legal fees, health insurance costs, and that better employment still meant working-class wages insufficient for supporting two families in two countries. The American Family Council with Elena helped us address the resentment that had built up over years of financial stress, her feeling like my Mexican family took priority over our Houston family, and my guilt about the impossible choices I was constantly making. We worked on communication about financial decisions, agreeing that emergencies in either country would be discussed and jointly decided rather than me unilaterally diverting funds, and on accepting that we might never achieve middle-class stability given our transnational obligations. The community organizing work that emerged from my experience included connecting with other Mexican immigrants carrying similar transnational financial burdens through organizations like the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights and immigrant worker centers. The collective experiences validated that my struggles weren't individual failures, but reflected systematic patterns affecting millions of immigrants who serve as economic lifelines across borders while barely surviving themselves. The advocacy development includes speaking about the hidden costs of immigration that include not just the migrants' personal sacrifices, but the transnational financial burdens that force working-class immigrants to support extended families on wages that don't cover one household, creating impossible situations and health-destroying stress that immigration narratives rarely acknowledge. The policy work includes advocating for living wages that acknowledge many working-class immigrants support families in multiple countries, for portable social benefits that could provide support across borders, for regulated remittance services with capped fees to reduce exploitation, and for economic development in sending countries that would reduce dependency on remittances by creating local employment opportunities. The second-generation impact concerns me as I watch my children grow up understanding that they're competing for resources with their grandparents and cousins in Mexico, sometimes resenting their father's absence and their family's poverty despite his constant work, and learning complex lessons about family obligation, transnational identity, and the cost of immigration that will shape their own values and choices about family support. Today, I continue working in construction, but have reduced to 50-hour weeks instead of 70, prioritizing my health and family presence over maximum earnings after my health collapse forced recognition that I was on an unsustainable path. I send $800 monthly to Mexico instead of $1,200, accepting the guilt and my family's disappointment while acknowledging that this is what I can sustain without destroying myself. The mentorship relationships I've developed focus on helping younger immigrants understand the need to set sustainable boundaries around transnational financial support before reaching the breaking point I experienced, challenging the cultural expectations that individual immigrants should sacrifice everything to support extended families while barely surviving themselves, and validating the guilt while also affirming the right to survival and well-being even when families depend on remittances. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with culturally competent providers who understand transnational family obligations and immigrant financial stress helps process guilt and develop sustainable boundaries. Community health centers providing affordable or sliding-scale mental health services make counseling accessible to working-class immigrants who can't afford private therapy. Immigrant worker organizations provide community support, collective advocacy, and validation that transnational financial burdens reflect systematic problems rather than individual failures. Marriage counseling helps couples address resentments and conflicts arising from transnational financial obligations and competing family needs. Financial counseling specialized in transnational family budgeting helps immigrants make strategic decisions about allocating limited resources across borders. Policy advocacy for living wages, portable social benefits. And remittance service regulation addresses systematic problems, creating impossible financial situations. Economic development initiatives in sending countries aim to reduce dependency on remittances by creating local employment opportunities. Peer support groups for immigrants carrying transnational financial burdens reduce isolation and provide practical strategies for managing impossible obligations. Today, when Americans wonder why working-class immigrants can't achieve financial stability despite working constantly, I explain that many of us are supporting extended families across borders on wages barely sufficient for one household, that remittances are economic lifelines for families in sending countries where employment opportunities are scarce, and that the expectation that individual immigrants will single-handedly support multiple families in multiple countries is unsustainable. Exploitation rather than admirable sacrifice. I'm drowning financially in two countries simultaneously, and I've learned that survival requires setting boundaries that disappoint family members while accepting that I've already given more than should be expected of any individual.